Good evening, everyone. My name is Emma Hurst and I'm a politician in Australia representing the Animal Justice Party, and I'm so pleased to be able to join you online today. I'd like to start by thanking the Farm Animal Rights Movement and their director Lisa De Crescenti and the organisation's new executive director Eric Langston. Farm's been advocating for farm animal rights and veganism since 1976. And because of their impressive track record and also their dedicated volunteers and supporters, they are able to host events like this. I've personally been following Farm and the work that they've been doing for many, many years. I've been vegan for over 22 years now, and I've always been impressed by the work that they've done. And so I thank them. And I also thank them for inviting me to come and speak today. I trace my passion for animals all the way back to when I was a young girl. I remember holding a hen in my arms and the hen was purring. And I remember thinking as a young child that this hen shows joy in the same way as my cat at home shows joy. And I thought, if I can't eat my cat, then how could I eat this hen? And I remember going home and writing letters to my parents and saying I wanted to go vegetarian. But for many years, I was a naive vegetarian. And it wasn't until somebody simply handed me a flyer on the street and I went home and I did my research that I found out about dairy calves being stolen from their mothers in the dairy industry and sent to slaughter, and day-old chicks in the egg industry being macerated alive. And it was literally like the lights went on. And I knew in that moment, not only would I go vegan and I'd be vegan for life, but that I wanted to be part of a great movement of change that was going to really bring changes to what was happening to these animals and to stop the cruelty that was occurring. At the time, I was studying education at university, but I knew that animal cruelty was a human-caused problem and we needed a human-focused solution. So I switched to studying psychology and I ended up doing my master's in health psychology. And I chose health psychology because health psychology really looks at how to create mass behaviour change. So how do you convince entire populations to wear seatbelts or to quit smoking? And I knew that I could take some of those strategies and try to develop campaigns to get people to change their behaviours away from supporting animal cruelty industries and switching their behaviours to plant-based diets and avoiding entertainment that includes animals and things like that as well. So I did my master's, and at the same time I started working for an animal charity here in Australia called Animal Liberation. And I worked as their campaign director for about 10 years. I've also worked for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And I also worked for World Animal Protection International. And then somebody approached me and asked me if I would run for Parliament. And it wasn't something I had ever considered. I'd never aspired, I guess, to a career in politics. And so I really had to ask myself the question, where am I best placed for animals? And I could see so many people doing great work, holding TVs on the street, handing out flyers, working on that individual behaviour change. And I could see great organisations. We've got a fantastic organisation here in Australia called Animals Australia, and they work with corporations to change so that you don't have travel companies selling tickets to animal shows, where you ensure that main chain restaurants have vegan options on their menu, making veganism more easily accessible and cheaper and normalising veganism. So I could see so much great work happening there. And yet in our political system, animals and animal protection was so far behind, and it wasn't reflecting where the community were or even where corporations were now moving to. In fact, there was a major expose of animal cruelty in the greyhound racing industry. And in New South Wales, there was actually a ban on greyhound racing, but the government backflipped and reinstated greyhound racing and now gives them enormous amounts of taxpayers' money, almost like an apology for daring to shut them down. And our federal parliament is looking to expand the live animal export industry, despite the fact we've had expose after expose exposing extreme animal cruelty on the ships and at the destinations for these animals. So I knew it was a big uphill battle, but I knew that we needed to be part of it. I knew we needed more voices for animals in Parliament, because where we were able to get great individual change and where we were able to get great corporate change, we needed to make sure that that political change and the laws were there as part of that package as well. Otherwise, the entire movement of change was going to be slowed down. So I ended up being elected into New South Wales Parliament in 2019, and I'm now one of 3 representatives for the Animal Justice Party through state parliaments, and we also have 3 councillors. So we're one of the fastest growing political parties. And we were founded really because there was nobody else in Parliament that was representing animals, that knew and understood how the laws were failing animals and fighting to change those laws. So I think we have a community of animal lovers who could see the issues that were happening and were frustrated that governments were ignoring these issues. And that's how we've managed to get elected. I thought I would start by talking through some of the wins that we've been able to get and to give a bit of a taste about why it's so important to actually have people representing animals within Parliament. So one of our big campaigns was actually fighting for tougher penalties for animal cruelty. We had some of the weakest penalties for animal cruelty right across the country and possibly across the world. But an act of animal cruelty in New South Wales had a maximum fine of $5,500. So what that meant was that we were seeing people going to court for animal cruelty. We saw a case with a mother ringtail possum where there was absolutely no fine given to the man who bashed this mother ringtail possum to death. There was another case where a man had beaten a dog and he filmed the act of beating the dog and sent it to his ex-girlfriend as a form of revenge and said, "I beat this dog as punishment to you for leaving me." And he saw a fine of $600 and he was allowed to have another animal in his care within 12 months after being charged with that offence. So we were seeing the courts reflecting on these really pathetic penalties that our system and our laws allowed for. And that's really because that $5,500 maximum fine was indicative of worst case scenario for somebody that was charged for an act of animal cruelty. So we needed to make sure those penalties increased. We wrote our own legislation to increase the penalty system, and we also ran a campaign alongside that. So every time someone went to court for animal cruelty, we followed that court case and we made sure that the media covered it and covered how pathetic these fines were that were coming through the court system. We ended up also getting the numbers in the upper house. So in New South Wales, we have 2 houses of parliament, and to pass legislation, the legislation has to pass both houses. In our house, if the government won't support our legislation, we can still get the numbers by campaigning and working with the other parties. So we ended up getting the numbers to support our legislation in the upper house. At that point, the government decided to put up their own legislation, which looked very, very similar to ours. And so we ended up passing their legislation. It meant that we saw an 8-fold increase in animal cruelty penalties and a doubling of jail time. And when their legislation came to us in the upper house, we could put amendments up. So as I mentioned, that man who had beaten the dog could have another animal 12 months later. And the authorities here that were taking people to court and prosecuting them for animal cruelty were finding it really difficult to get courts to put animal bans on people who had committed horrific acts of cruelty. And in fact, bestiality, which came under another act, the courts didn't even have the provision to be able to give somebody an animal ban. So until the Animal Justice Party were elected, anyone that had been charged with bestiality could go out the next day and have another animal potentially in their care. So we changed the law there and we amended it so that animal abusers have mandatory lifetime animal bans. And so hopefully that will go forward to be able to protect animals going into the future. Another space that we've done a huge amount of work on is the link between domestic violence and animal cruelty. So we know that there's a link between people who are violent towards people and people who are violent towards non-human animals. So in the domestic violence space, we know that around 70% of victims of domestic violence delay leaving a violent situation and actually remain in a dangerous situation because they don't have the ability to flee with their animals, and they know that the animal will be in danger if the animal is left behind. So we worked with the Attorney General here in New South Wales. We had $500,000 allocated to refuges to build shelters for animals so that animals could also flee domestic violence situations. And we had animals included on apprehended domestic violence orders. So what that means is that in the same way as a person could be protected under an ADVO, an animal can also be in a similar way as a protected person on an apprehended domestic violence order. And we also had the link between domestic violence and animal abuse recognised in the legislation. We're not done in this space. We also need to get animals out of property law. We know, and it's replicated in most places around the world where animals are considered property under the law. That's really problematic as well in the domestic violence space, as well as so many other spaces, as I'm sure many of you are aware of. But we need to make sure that people can actually gain custody of animals so that they are removed from the abusers and make sure that they're not left in dangerous situations. Another thing that we did around the domestic violence space was stopping strata schemes from applying blanket bans on animals, because that really closes huge markets for people to be able to access housing. And we also were seeing these really awful retrospective bans in a lot of strata complexes. And that includes things like townhouses that might have very large backyards and would be very suitable for many different types of animals. And obviously we want to encourage people to rescue animals from pounds that are on death row. There was one situation at the time, just at the first COVID outbreak, when people were first going into lockdown, one strata complex put in a retrospective ban. An elderly man had a rescued greyhound, and he was told that he would either have to get rid of the greyhound or move out of his home that he'd been living in for about 20 years or more. During a pandemic. So we needed to get rid of those, which we did as well. The other space we've been working on is the link between animal abuse and child abuse. And so we've just changed, the working with children's check system throughout New South Wales, so that animal abusers can no longer pass a working with children's check clearance. And that protects children from animal abusers, but it also protects animals because it adds another layer onto people who are being charged for animal cruelty. It recognises how serious charges of animal cruelty are. And it means that if somebody's been found guilty of extreme animal cruelty, that they can't go on and continue to work with children, they can't gain employment in these areas, and they can't volunteer in them either. One of the big wins that we had, which I'm extremely proud of, is a ban on the use of cetaceans in entertainment. So we have 2 facilities in Australia, 2 dolphinariums where animals are still being forced to do circus-style tricks. Thankfully, we don't have whales in captivity in these dolphinariums, but we do have dolphins. We have SeaWorld up on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and we have a smaller facility here in New South Wales. So we fought for an inquiry, and what that inquiry exposed through the parliamentary system is that this is a dying business model and that it had lost its social license. So people no longer found it acceptable to breed these animals in captivity and force them to do these shows. But these industries were still breeding animals into these industries. And so we were seeing dolphins, which could live for up to 50 years, being bred into an industry that was already dying, which means that if an animal was born into this industry today, they could still be there in 2072. And if this is an industry that is already dying, then it's only going to get worse. And what do we do with these animals in 2072 when they've been born and bred into captivity? So we ended up getting some regulations passed in New South Wales, no breeding of more animals no breeding of cetaceans in captivity, and also no importing of these animals and no wild capture. So essentially, no new facilities can actually set up in New South Wales. And we now only have that one facility. They've only got a few dolphins left. They can't expand. And we've also been working with them into another aspect that came out of the inquiry, was actually potentially looking into building a sea sanctuary and retiring the last dolphins in New South Wales. And so that's an ongoing piece of work that's being done. And of course, we've still got a lot of pressure going on in Queensland, where SeaWorld is still functioning, unfortunately, but it is the last now facility in Australia. I'm sorry, I'm partly losing my voice, but I do have some water here. And the other win that I wanted to quickly talk through was our changes into the legislation on bestiality and crush videos. So shockingly, it is not illegal to possess, distribute, and even in many cases to produce bestiality and crush videos in New South Wales. And I did see that in the US, there was videos around crush laws not that long ago. And I saw those being passed in the US, and I had a look here and I realized that our legislation was really falling behind. If you don't know what a crush video is, don't look it up. It's essentially a fetish animal cruelty video. And so it's also often found alongside child abuse material. So again, we're going back to that link between human violence and non-human violence as well. So we put some legislation up to ensure that the possession, distribution and production of these videos is outlawed. I just put a lolly in my throat to make it try and last a little bit longer. I'm very sorry that I am losing my voice. It's going to be a busy year for us going forward. I'm just trying to get my throat on so I can continue to talk. So it's going to be a busy year for us going forward. One thing that we've been fighting for now for over 2 years is an inquiry into the use of animals into experimentation. So 2 years ago, 3 baboons actually escaped from a medical research facility in New South Wales. I apologise. 3 baboons escaped from a research facility in New South Wales, and it really opened up to the world that primate experimentation was still ongoing. And we've been pushing for an investigation since then. There's been other experiments that have really been brought to our attention, including forced smoking experiments where animals are being forced to inhale cigarette smoke, and forced drowning experiments where animals are actually being forced to drown in beakers of water. And of course, a lot of these experiments are being funded by taxpayers. And there's no transparency in this industry where there's no transparency where taxpayers' money is actually being used to fund these animal experiments. And we've asked questions in Parliament, and the Minister has told us that they don't even keep records of what money and how much money is being used in animal experimentation. So we can't even get answers there. So we've just announced an inquiry into the use of animals in experimentation. And that will include all animals, not just primates. And so we're just beginning our work in that particular space, which is really, really exciting. Another area that we're going to be working on is puppy farming, which is the intensive factory farming of dogs for a pet trade industry. We've got a major issue of puppy farming in Australia, particularly in New South Wales. Australians love animals. A lot of people have companion animals in their home, but what that does is it opens up an industry rife with abuse, which is puppy farming. And in New South Wales, it's particularly bad. There are other states that are looking at introducing laws to ensure that puppy farming, doesn't continue to exist. But what that means is that a lot of these puppy farmers are simply moving across the border into New South Wales, where our weak laws do virtually nothing to protect these animals. And so we're hearing from councils that they're getting development applications for hundreds and hundreds of dogs to build these different facilities. And so it's a really big problem. I ended up designing legislation last year and putting it up. Unfortunately, there's just been this big pushback from other political parties. And so it's now been pushed into an inquiry as well, which means we're going to be fighting for this for another 6 months. So that's going to be a big one for us going forward. But it really goes to show the struggle of the work that we do and how hard it is to actually get legislative change for animals when we've got such a conservative government where it's controversial to talk about ending the intensive factory farming of dogs. You can imagine how hard it is to get anyone else to work with us on other animal issues. And when I was going through all of our wins, you would have noticed that I didn't mention anything about farmed animals. And it's not because we're not working on farm animal issues, we certainly are. But it is very, very difficult with such a conservative government. We've got a two-party system where they're both so heavily involved in industry, it's very hard to get any kind of changes. And the fact that we've now been fighting for over a year just to end puppy farming is really evident of how hard it is to really get changes for any animals. The other thing that we're going to be doing a lot of work on is we're currently reviewing the entire legislation, the act that actually includes all laws and animal protection laws. So everything from tethering to shade, to fines for animal cruelty, to battery cages. So that entire piece of legislation is being reviewed and rewritten. So the government has put forward their proposed legislation and they're making very few changes. Obviously, we will have thousands of amendments because our legislation is so poor and it fails to protect animals. But this really goes into another major piece of work that we really need to be doing. And it's something that I see happening globally. In New South Wales, we have what's called a Minister for Agriculture, and it's the Minister for Agriculture that holds the portfolio for animal protection. So what that means is that we've got a Minister for a Minister for Agriculture that represents the entire industry that is using and abusing animals for profit, also holding the protection portfolio, which is a major conflict of interest. And so, of course, these ministers are looking after industry and ignoring animal welfare or animal rights or animal protection of any kind. In fact, they're often fighting against it. And so this is a major issue that we have. So a big part of our movement going forward is to fight for a Minister for Animal Protection that is standalone and separate from the Minister for Agriculture, because we're not going to get any changes for animals until we can take that portfolio away from the Minister for Agriculture, who will continue to turn a blind eye to major animal protection issues. And this is something I've seen around the world. It's almost like our entire animal protection system has been set up to fail. And that is something I see whenever I talk to people all around the world. Not only do we often have the portfolio for animal protection with someone like an agriculture minister, but we often have charities trying to uphold the law. So we've got this really weak legislation, very, very difficult to change any part of that legislation. And then we have charities having to fundraise from the public to be able to uphold the law. It's the only piece of criminal legislation in this country that actually requires fundraising. So in Australia, it's the RSPCA. I think in the US, I think you might have the ASPCA. I don't know if it's exactly the same system, but they get it in New South Wales. They get about 6% of their investigation and enforcement funding from the government, and the rest they have to do fund runs and various other things to try to get enough money to actually investigate and prosecute complaints of animal cruelty. So, a lot of animal cruelty complaints aren't being investigated. The majority of them aren't being prosecuted. And that's based on laws that are already so weak. And we have major exemptions to animal cruelty. So we'll have a law about animal cruelty, about containing an animal for longer than a certain period of time. And then there'll be exemptions for hens in the battery egg industry. And there'll be exemptions for pigs who will be put in sow stalls, for example. So that's why it seems like we're not doing a lot around farm animal issues. But I think that our biggest campaign going forward will be making sure we get that independent Office of Animal Protection. But from being in Parliament now, and I know that the animal groups in Australia have been pushing for an independent Office of Animal Protection, and we still need that. But we can't have that independent office reporting to the Agriculture Minister, because it means that nothing's going to happen. It means that those reports are going to continue to be ignored. So we also need that Minister for Animal Protection, and with them, the Independent Office of Animal Protection. So that will be our main focus for farmed animals really going forward, to be actually to shake up the entire system and change the way that we enforce animal cruelty laws, and also to change how we oversee those laws, and making sure that the community attitudes to animals and making sure that the science is reflected throughout our legislation. I also wanted to talk about how to get politically involved with animals. So I know a lot of people feel more comfortable going out in the street and talking to the public. And many people, one thing that I was really shocked about when I first got elected was actually that, whenever an issue came up in Parliament, there was lobbyists, and they're called lobbyists because they literally sit in the lobby and they wait for you to come out of your office space, and they'll come up and start talking to you, or they'll knock on your door. And they are there on every single issue that we're debating through Parliament. So whether we're talking about abortion law reform, or whether we're talking about drug law reform, whatever it is, there's groups there to come in and talk to you about it. But whenever we brought up an animal issue, the halls were silent. There was nobody there. And I've been trying to encourage a lot of the animal groups to actually come in and start lobbying within Parliament. And it was almost as though, lobbying was a dirty word. And a lot of these groups, I think, almost felt a frustration from politics because of the backflips, because of the push to keep expanding these industries and providing subsidies to hold up certain industries as well. So it was a really frustrating space. But I really want to encourage people to request a meeting with their local representatives. And even though I know the governance systems are a little bit different from wherever you are in the world, but quite often there's a local government system like a council system, then you've got your state representatives and your federal representatives. So go and actually reach out to them, request a meeting, talk to them about a particular animal issue that you're passionate about, and ask them to take action. I think that's a really big thing. And I know it sounds really obvious, but I've sat in so many meetings, and I'm saying this as a politician, and it's a politician's dream when somebody comes in and they talk to you about an issue, but they don't ask you to do anything. Happy to hear and just sit here and listen to your problem. But if you're not going to ask me to do anything specific, then I'm probably not going to act, and I'm probably going to continue to work on the things that I'm already working on. I work 90 hours a week. If you don't have a specific ask, then I'm not going to try and work out what that is. So ask them for something really, really specific. My big thing is start friendly and then become fierce. And that's something that I also find a lot of animal protection activists don't often do. They start friendly, and either the person ignores them, they ignore the meeting requests, or they meet with them and they're rude and they disagree and they say, well, they were difficult, and so I'm done with them and I'm going to go back to doing street activism. The other thing, which is even more common, is that you meet with a politician, they're very friendly, they agree it's a problem, and then they don't act. And you keep being friendly with them over and over and over. And, you know, I've spoken to so many people that said, oh, he seemed really open to the idea. And I say, well, where is it now? And they said, well, he still hasn't acted, it's been 2 years. And so that's where I say, you know, you've got to at some point stop being friendly and be a little bit more fierce. And I don't mean being aggressive or being rude, but actually just holding them publicly to account. A lot of politicians are approached with so many ideas, and if everyone's just being friendly, then they won't act on it because it's not pushing on them hard enough. You need to continue to push this issue right in front of them. And a lot of the work around that is actually working really closely with the media. You know, if your local representatives won't meet with you or won't work on the issues with you, build a relationship with the local newspaper, build a relationship with some of the radio stations and talk with them. Learn how to create a media hook. Learn how to run a protest outside of that office and invite the media to come along and build into those media relations, because it's so important to be able to get those stories out there and to build that pressure on politicians to act. And you might find that a politician that was ignoring your issue might suddenly take it on. I can't tell you how many times that's happened for me in Parliament, where I've got enough media attention on that issue, and I always focus on the media that they listen to. So if it's a Conservative politician, then you need to actually work with that Conservative media, even if you might yourself be a progressive. So be friendly, then be fierce. And the other thing that I always remind people is ask for way more than you think that they will give you. So, and I've got a really good example of this. I went to the Blue Mountains Council and I met with the mayor there, and we were talking about the bushfire response. So Australia had those Black Summer bushfires. You know, our entire country was on fire and we couldn't put them out. And we were talking with councils about how they responded and what measures needed to be put in place in future to make sure that wildlife carers get access to areas to rescue these animals, and various other issues that really came up during those fires. And at the end of the meeting, he said, oh, is that, you know, let me know if there's ever anything else I can do for you. And I said, well, actually, we've been working with councils to do fur bans. So we've been asking councils to actually put forward a notice of motion to ban the sale of fur on council land. So we gave him the notice of motion. He said, yes, we're happy to do this. I'll do this as well. And he said, if there's anything else I can do, just let me know. And I said, well, actually, we've got an inquiry into the use of exotic animals in circuses. And even though you already have a circus ban, if you could reinstate that ban, that would help build the pressure within our inquiry onto this. And he said, okay, yeah, we can do that. That's very, very easy. If there's anything else, though, let me know. And I said, well, actually, you could also ban the use of 1080 poison, which is a dreadful poison that is used throughout Australia, which causes immense suffering to any animal that consumes it. 72 hours of suffering. I think in the US, it's considered a potential weapon of mass destruction. And here in Australia, we drop it from aeroplanes. It's just absolutely dreadful. So we were talking about a ban on 1080 poison throughout the Blue Mountains. And he said, yes, actually we will. We'll put that through. And then he sort of tentatively said, if there's anything else. And I said, yes, there's something else. And at this point, I didn't have anything else. So I had to suddenly think on my feet, what else could I propose that this council to put forward? So I said, you could be the first council ever to put up a notice of motion recognising the sentience of all animals. And so he said, yes, we will be the first council in Australia to recognise the sentience of animals. And so I think the moral of this story is to always ask for more than what you think you can get. I know a lot of people often come in with the compromise thinking that then they will appear more reasonable. But if you come in at a compromise, that's where people will start to try to compromise from. So I always suggest to people to start well over the other side, and then compromise from there. So don't ever come in with a compromised position and always ask for way more than you think you will get. Don't meet with a politician and suggest a question for them to ask in Parliament. Ask them for legislation changes. Go in big. I'm so sorry that I kept losing my voice throughout this talk. I don't know what's happened with my throat. I'm going to have a quick look at the Q&A. I kind of rushed through some of the different aspects I was going to talk to you about because of the issue I'm having with my throat. I had COVID a couple of months ago. I don't know if that's what's now affected my throat, but it's really not coping very well. But let's see, I'll start reading some of these questions and we'll see how we go. I've got a question here from Shreya. I'm so sorry if I apologise if I have said that wrong. What efforts are in the works for animals who are exploited for food? And how receptive is the Parliament to animal rights issues? So yes, this is a huge issue in New South Wales. Every time I go into Parliament and talk about the plight of animals used for food, it's almost, people almost become quite aggressive towards you. I ended up, at the beginning of each parliamentary day, we can put up a notice of motion. And so I decided to put up every single issue associated with animal agribusiness. With everything from battery cages to the cruelty in free-range farming to the environmental effects of animal agribusiness to the use of poisons by the animal agribusiness industry. We covered every single one. And there was some people who were coming up to me and saying that they were really shocked and really surprised. They had no idea, for example, that dairy calves were taken from their mothers. They had no idea what happened in the honey industry, for example. And some people really approached it with an open mind. But even though you can kind of influence individual politicians, it's really quite difficult to get an entire political party to switch their position on an issue. So that's where we really struggle. And it's a big uphill battle. But as I say, I really believe now, having been in for a couple of years, and actually I'll give you an example of just how difficult it is to change anything. My colleague put up what I considered, because I'm at heart, I'm an animal rights activist. I feel like the welfare argument has a lot of ethical issues with it, and sometimes even logical issues. I don't support free-range farming, for example. I think that we need to switch quite quickly to a plant-based lifestyle, and we need to do that globally. But my colleague put up a bill to provide mandatory pain relief for a procedure in Australia called mulesing. And there's been a lot of great campaigns overseas against the practice of mulesing in Australia, which involves cutting off a very large chunk of flesh from a sheep's anus. And they don't provide any pain relief. Now that's done because sheep don't belong in Australia. And because sheep don't belong in Australia and they're woolly animals, they have a huge amount of wool on them. And we've got a very hot climate. And they also breed the sheep to grow folds in their skin so that they'll have more wool on them. And because they're hot and because the folds of skin and the wool is all near each other, they get sweaty and they get what's called fly strike, because flies go in there and lay their eggs and they end up in these absolutely dreadful conditions. If they can create a scar around their bottom, then the wool won't grow there and they won't get fly strike around the anus. I just seen this Shannon saying mulesing is horrendous. It is just awful. And it is a thick and large piece of flesh that is literally cut off with a blade while the sheep are strapped to a fence line. And no pain relief, none at all. For a few cents per sheep, you could reduce the pain and the stress that's actually caused to these animals. And that was the only thing that my colleague put up as a bill, and it wasn't supported. It wasn't supported by the government, and it wasn't supported by the opposition. So the two main parties in Parliament did not support mandatory pain relief for something as horrific as that. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's why I'm saying, and of course it's the lobby groups for these industries that come into Parliament and tell the ministers what their position needs to be. And it's the ministers for agriculture that then decide on behalf of those entire political parties, no, we're not going to support this. So that's how frustrating it is. And we are certainly working in this space, and we will continue to advocate because somebody needs to be in there. And I suppose that's probably another thing I should explain as well. We do probably I split my work into two folders. I do the things that I think we could at a push change, which was, dolphins in entertainment, penalties for animal abuse. And then in my other folder, it's all the things that someone has to put on the table. So one piece of legislation that I've been working on, which I'm very, very excited, and I hope to introduce at the end of this year, is a speciesism bill, which will outlaw speciesism in Australia. And I've been working with Professor Peter Singer on that piece of legislation, who wrote Animal Liberation, the book, and termed the word speciesism as well. And so again, these political parties aren't going to know what to do with this, and I'm not going to get the numbers to pass it, but it's one of those things where somebody has to have that idea first and put it on the table, and then you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and then you normalize that. If we start being too soft and we only focus on the things that we can win, then nobody's ever going to be starting to put all these other ideas on the table and actually starting to get debates on these really important issues. So that's probably one of the big bills that I'm going to be putting forward, is outlawing speciesism and treating species of animals differently. So watch that space. Are your party members vegan, or do they have to be? Party members, no, they don't have to be vegan, but our elected representatives do have to be vegan. So if you want to put your hand up to run as a council member or as a state MP or a federal MP, then you do have to actually sign a document that you follow a vegan lifestyle and that you will continue to do so. And I think that that's really important, because I think if we're going into Parliament to represent animals, then we can't be in any way abusing animals at the same time. So that's a really important part of the Animal Justice Party. But we don't block out people from coming into the party, because of course that's how we are best able to influence people to change. What keeps you motivated and keep going when there's so much resistance to making change to protect animals? That's a really good question. I think for me, well, there's a couple of things. I've been involved in this movement now for probably about 15 or 16 years, which is a long time. I think seeing those changes that we have been able to make, and I have to say that even though it's quite difficult in politics, I've been able to make more change in the last few years that I've been elected into Parliament than I ever did in my other campaign jobs. So seeing those wins and also recognising and looking at what's happening to these animals, I think, sometimes I get angry and I feel hopeless, but I take a lot of that energy and I turn that into the work I do in recognising that we're working and building on change. And a lot of that has to do with support networks. So I'm really lucky. I get 2 staff. And so we work really closely as a team, and we've got our own separate office space, but we're all in the same building with all these other politicians and, not people we would normally be spending time with. And I spend a significant amount of time with these people. And so I need to also have my debrief. I need to also have those good relationships with my staff members, and we need to all support each other because it's so important that we continue to work together for animals. There's 2 other things that I do. I think that the 2 things that probably affect me the most is, the criticisms and the attacks that we get. I get a lot of threats of physical and sexual violence from men online. And we also have a political party in Australia called the Shooters Party. And so they'll often put up an attack post online about something that they're suggesting I've done. It's usually a complete lie. They come up with some really imaginative things, which would be wonderful. They posted a while ago saying that we had convinced the government essentially to outlaw fishing, which to me I think would be wonderful. The government would never do that, but they just wanted to stir up their own constituents to come and attack me. And so, then we get inundated with all these threats. And it's quite stressful and it's quite frustrating sometimes because it's usually not based on anything that's true. And so one thing that I do to try to deal with that is I always say to myself that I must be doing an absolutely amazing job because otherwise they wouldn't be behaving this way. So they must be threatened by the work that we're doing. If we weren't achieving anything, they wouldn't be focused on me and they wouldn't be focused on the work that my team's doing. So we always try to turn it around into a compliment. And if we're attacked by somebody within the vegan community, which happens a little bit as well, I think sometimes people might have a slightly different opinion, but they'll send an abusive email or send an aggressive email that we haven't done enough on one issue. And so what I often do in those situations is I step away for a moment and I make an intentional decision and I think about it. I think about the hen inside a battery cage. I think about the sow in the sow stall. And I think about the life that they're suffering. And then I think about this person's email that has upset me. And I realize I've only got so much time in the world and I've only got so much energy and I need to make a choice. I can either choose that animal or I can choose to put my time and energy towards this person that's attacking me. And the choice is obvious every single time. And that is that I choose the animals and I don't choose this person. And so when I get those emails, I simply now say to myself, I don't choose you. And I walk away. And that's sort of how I close those situations. Go back into the Q&A. I see Mike's got a question. How much support do you get from the other political parties on animal protection issues? That's a really good question. So we've got a really interesting situation in New South Wales Parliament. So if I get the government support, then I can pass legislation. If the government doesn't support me, then I need the Greens. So we've got a political party called the Greens. They're an environmental human rights party. We get along really well with them. A lot of our environmental stuff crosses over because we also focus on the environment because, the two are so interlinked. So we work really closely with them. They usually support most of our animal stuff. Then we need to get the opposition, which is the Labor Party. The Labor Party are the less conservative party. So they will, 50% of the time support us. They won't support us probably on most farm animal issues, but they'll support us on a lot of other stuff. Sometimes they will support us on farm animal issues, but usually more welfareist rather than animal rights issues. Sometimes when we focus on things like plant-based agriculture, cellular-based meats, and building those alternatives, they'll support us on things like that, which is really positive. And then we've got independent Justin Field, who works in the office next door to me, who's a former Green, and so he always supports the work that we're doing. And then I need one more vote. And we've got 3 other political parties. So we've got the Shooters, and so they're the last group that I'll approach. Then we've got a group called the Christian Democrats, which is a Christian organisation or political party. And then we've got another one called One Nation, which is very conservative, very sort of white Australian focused party. And so our next choice will be to go to the Christian Democratic Party. And they're quite animal friendly. So we will often get their support for a lot of animal protection. That's why we're able to pass quite a few pieces of legislation in the upper house. And occasionally One Nation will support us as well. So yeah, we do have to work with a broad range of people to get anything passed, but it's an interesting space because, you know, and I was talking to somebody just recently, they were saying, well, you know, what if you focus more on environment rather than focusing on animal protection? And the political parties have already really solidly decided where they all stand on environmental issues. Whereas when you come in with animal issues, nobody has any policies. And in one way, we've always thought that that was so terrible because it means that they haven't even considered animals. But actually stepping in as a politician and talking about animals, when you've got political parties that don't have any policies, it means that you're actually relying on them to think from their own moral conscience, basically. And so I passed a piece of legislation last year in response to a council that shot a mother dog and her puppies and well, 16 dogs in total in what's called convenience killing. So they didn't even try to rehome the animals. There was 2 rescue groups willing to take them in, and they just said, no, this is too hard for us. They shut the doors and they shot all the dogs in their care. So we wanted to make sure that that was illegal, that every council pound had to work with 2 rescue groups and try to actually rehome all the animals in their care. And so we put up a very simple piece of legislation, but that's the sort of legislation we can go to the Conservative side of Parliament and say, this will just simply get dogs off death row. And so people were, you know, quite easy to convince to actually support us on that sort of legislation. And it was based on their moral conscience, rather than them going and saying, well, where does our political party actually sit on this issue, and making a decision from there, which can be a little bit more cutthroat. Alex asks, does your party have a position on non-animal issues? Yes. So I'll just have another little bit of water. My throat hasn't given out on us yet. So the question was, do we have a position on non-animal issues? So yes. We started out and we got our first elected representative very, very quickly. And we'd only developed our animal policies at that point and started on our environmental policies. And so they were the 2 major areas that we had focused on right at the beginning. And since then, we realised that we needed to expand out. So, you know, we started out by looking at what we call KERN, kindness, equality, rationality, and non-violence. And we're still in the process of developing policies or positions on all other issues. So one big issue that's coming up now in Parliament is voluntary assisted dying. So our party supports voluntary assisted dying. We are a co-sponsor of the bill that's coming forward in New South Wales Parliament. And so a lot of these issues we're now going through. So you can actually find our policies and our position statements on the National Party website. And that's an ongoing process. We're constantly reviewing all of those policies and the positions and making sure that, and generally our party is far more progressive. We're not a conservative party, but we're also looking at, you know, drug law reform, and a lot of those other spaces as well, so that we're continuing to work in those spaces because we want our people to know where we're going to vote on these other issues, because non-animal issues always come up in Parliament. And I think it's really important that if somebody's going to vote in a political party, and even though it's rare that we will put up our own legislation because there's so much work to be done on the animals, people need to know that we're not going to go rogue and suddenly vote for something that's against something that's a major human rights issue. So we need to make sure that that's a really clear and open process. And so we're heavily working on that space at the moment. Aha, Paula, I like this question. With the benefit of hindsight, what advice would you give Emma, the candidate, when planning your campaign for office? Currently planning our current campaigns. That's a really, really good question. I think that media is enormous. I think media is a huge part of it. I think that, and it was actually something that came to me recently. I was talking to an activist who was really upset that the media hadn't covered their story. But I found that the way they had actually pitched their article to the media was they rang up and said, I want to talk about issue X. I want to talk about pigs. And then they were angry that they didn't want to, or they didn't write an article. You need to remember that everything has to be timely and relevant, and you need to have a hook. The journalist will say, why now, for everything that you bring to them. So an election in and of itself is a great why now, and then hooking into that as to why this issue is so important. And, you know, you can do different things to try to create an image for media, especially if you're going to the newspaper. Remember, if you're going to a TV, you've got to create vision. So I think that media is a huge part of it. One thing that I did do during the election, because it was very, very difficult and competitive to get media, I was pitching stories to the media. I was probably sending off anywhere between 10 to 15 pitches every single day. And we still didn't get anywhere near as much media as I would have liked to. But I think that that's the effort. Don't worry if people keep saying no, just get up every morning and keep going. And the other thing we did a huge amount of work on was social media. And so we worked out the location of the people who are more likely to vote for us and targeted our ads based on locality and the type of people that were similar to our voters but may not necessarily be our voters. So Facebook ads can be really, really useful at actually targeting those voters. Be prepared not to get much sleep in the campaign as well. You know, we really kept going and going and going. One thing that, you know, and going back to sort of our non-animal policies is one area that I do a huge amount of work in outside of animals is around women's rights as well. And so, you know, that also helps us to go outside of your regular spaces and speak with other people, and then also bring in the animal issues to them too. So you're sort of doubling up. You're actually creating a platform for animal protection, but also bringing more people into the party on other issues that you really care about. So I think that would probably be my top pointers. I remember after our campaign, and we did a huge amount of how to vote cards and things like that. Actually, one thing I think that was probably a lesson, we spent a large amount of money on these big corflutes that we posted all around Sydney. And looking back, I don't think that that was the best spend of money. I think that we probably would have done better with Facebook advertising than having a corflute of my face, you know, somewhere randomly on the road. I don't think that created a familiarity just by having a poster up. So I think that that was probably one thing I would have changed and focused more on sort of that engagement. So go to these community forums, talk to people, and yeah, do more of that sort of work. And Mike says, what are the Animal Justice Party's major goals for this year? So the beginning of this year, I've got multiple inquiries. So I've got the inquiry onto animals used in medical experimentation. I've got the inquiry into puppy farming. I've got an inquiry into the enforcement of animal protection laws. So that's like the RSPCA and how they're actually investigating and enforcing animal cruelty. And then we've got an inquiry into the POCTA laws, the Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act. So that's the entire act that decides what's legal and what's illegal to do to animals. So that's really going to fill up my first 6 months. When I first go back this month, so we start sitting again at the end of this month. that piece of legislation that I explained about the pound reform to make it illegal for them to just kill off animals, to stop convenience killing, and to make sure that they're working with rescue groups to get animals out. That comes up probably in February. So that passed in our house and it's now with the lower house. And we work quite closely with an independent member in the other place called Alex Greenwich, who's the member for Sydney, and he's very progressive and very supportive of animal issues. So he's going to take that legislation on in the lower house. And so we've been very busy trying to get the numbers in the lower house, where I'm less familiar with the politicians working in that space, but we're trying to get the numbers to be able to pass that legislation there. So hopefully we'll start the year on a win. And then there'll be, a lot of work going into the idea and the campaign around a Minister for Animal Protection. As I say, if we can at least get one of the major parties to commit to having a separated Minister for Animal Protection, then we can start getting onto the really important work of huge legislative changes for animals. Another piece of work that we're working on is really around transformation. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term. I was actually on a dairy inquiry last year. Now, the dairy industry wanted the inquiry. Essentially, they were asking the government for more subsidies, so more taxpayers' money to prop up their industry, because consumers were switching more and more to these plant-based alternatives and plant-based milks. And so their bottom dollar was going down. And so they were asking for free milk to go into schools paid by the taxpayer. They were asking for a boost up, for farmers individually to keep going. And they were also calling for labelling law changes so that the alternative milks can't call themselves milks. I know that that's happening all over the world. And so that was a really interesting inquiry. I was the only person, obviously, on that inquiry that was representing animals. And all the other MPs that were on that inquiry were supporting industry. But what we did manage to get through in that inquiry was a recommendation that the government actually, and what I want to see is actually the subsidies that are being used to prop up these industries to be used to actually help farmers transition out of the industry. And the recommendation was that the government put funding towards getting farmers out of the dairy industry and obviously then into plant-based agriculture. And so that we ended up managing to get that as a recommendation. And I think that's the first transformation recommendation from a parliamentary inquiry that we've heard of. And so it's a step forward. It'll be interesting to see how the government responds to that. But that's some of the work that we will continue to do going forward, is trying to get that funding. We're also sort of trying to get a lot of funding towards cellular-based agriculture. I have a couple of mentees and I'm working with them, and they're working towards how to make sure our laws actually support cellular-based agriculture. Those are sort of alternative developments to make sure that they're being able to done without harming animals and that they're supported legally, both for importation but also to produce here in Australia as well. I think I have one more question, and then I'll have to stop because my voice will really be gone. Oh, no, it just says, thank you, Emma, much appreciated. Wonderful, thank you, Paula. And I'm just having a quick look at the chat, but I think everybody put all their questions in the Q&A. They did. Wonderful. I've got some beautiful comments here, so thank you all. I am going to pull this to an end now. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to Farm for putting this on. I apologise again about my voice. I know I had to stop a few times throughout this, but we managed to get through the hour with all my water that I kept going to have, and I had a couple of throat lozenges. But thank you for your patience, and thank you for waiting through with me so that we could get through all the content that we did. Thank you, and I hope sometime in the very near future to visit you guys in the US, one of my favorite countries to visit. And thank you again. Bye.